is a start. That's not the one. Hello, I'm Simon. Way back in the 90s, when I was a wee lad, we didn't have PCs in our computers. Sorry, what? Schools. We didn't have PCs in our schools. Screwed it already. We had things like this. Acorn computers, running an operating system called RISC OS. This is my first real exposure to the sort of desktop GUI environment that we see all the time today. Previously I'd used things like Commodore 64, or I did have an old Amstrad PC 1512 when I was really young, running MS-DOS 4.1. This is the first time I ever used anything that involved like a mouse and Windows and stuff like that. I played around a little bit with BASIC on the Commodore 64, but my crappy little text programs never really felt like an application like a proper grown-up programmer would make. I remember borrowing a copy of the RISC OS user guide from school. And I remember reading a section in it, and it told you how applications on RISC OS effectively just folders with an exclamation mark as the start of the name, or a pling as they call them. So I played around a bit and I was able to make my own application folders by creating a folder. I could make my own silly little icon and I could run my own little basic program, and I was kind of hooked. I loved it. For my 13th birthday, my dad bought me one of these, an Acorn A3010. Now it wasn't very good, it was quite out of date at the time, and it only had 1 megabyte of RAM, so I had to learn how to unload operating system modules just to be able to run Lemmings on it. But it allowed me to play around and kind of learn about computers, a little bit about programming. I eventually souped it up a little bit. I put 4 megabyte RAM upgrade in there. I got an external SCSI CD-ROM drive and hard drive, and then for one Christmas I even got a copy of the RISC OS Programmer's Reference Manuals for my present. I remember that was the same time my dad gave me the 4 megabyte upgrade, and I remember he put it inside this massive box, and it was only this tiny little board like that. Funny prick. So I used that machine and I was writing all sorts of little programs of it, just trying stuff out. I originally started learning how to do window-based programs using a library called Dr. Wimp in BBC Basic, and then eventually I kind of moved on to trying to read the programmer's reference manuals and actually make window-based programs directly talking to the SWIs, I suppose they're called, or SWIs, I never said that out loud. The software interrupts that actually talk to the operating system. I remember I wrote one program called Mod Maker, and it was effectively just a little window-based program where you type in some crap into the boxes and it would generate an operating system module for you, and then you could run applications that claimed they needed this particular module, but a lot of them didn't actually, so it still worked anyway, so that's quite good. No idea what happened to that stuff now. By the time I got to college, everyone had moved on to Windows, so I got a Windows PC, and the A3010 ended up in a cupboard, and then a little bit later I lent it to somebody who's supposedly my friend, and then they sold it. Utter Back in '98, Black Thursday hit Acorn, and they decided they were no longer going to make sort of consumer computers like this. RISC OS, the operating system, was taken over by this other group called RISC OS Limited. I remember seeing a picture of them in Acorn User Magazine. It was like 3 people or something like that sat in a little office with computers everywhere, and I thought, that's quite cool, I'd like to do that. But obviously I'm going to be a professional pool player, so I can't. But fast forward to 2012, and I haven't touched RISC OS for quite a while. I remember seeing an advert for the Raspberry Pi that was just coming out, and one of the operating systems they were advertising they were going to support was actually RISC OS. Turns out RISC OS had kind of moved on a little bit, and there'd been some sort of arguments between different manufacturers. I don't have anything to do with that. And then eventually the operating system had been mostly open sourced by a company called RISC OS Open Limited, and they were porting RISC OS to new platforms, one of which was the Raspberry Pi. So I thought, you know what, I should get involved in that. So I've ordered myself a copy of this, the C++ desktop development environment, and I thought, I know what I'll do. Before the Raspberry Pi comes out, I'll download the emulator and I'll write some programs, and maybe I can get involved in that, and maybe that can get me out of the place I was working at the time. But I found once I got that, it was really hard to kind of get anything going with it, and there was a lot of inertia I found, because at the time I'd been writing C programs for about 9 years, so I was okay at it. But I've been using things like microcontrollers, or I've been using Visual C++, so I was kind of used to like the IDE tools, and I found the DDE really difficult to get going. Just to try and make one program compile was a lot of hard work. And I found that the inertia of trying to get anywhere, and especially the fact that things like keyboard shortcuts are different and everything like that, meant that I'd spend a few weeks on something, and then I'd kind of like, the enthusiasm would drop off and I'd not got anywhere with it. And then before you know it, I was also doing like an Open University degree and stuff like that as well. So I found that it just kind of, I'd do a few weeks and then I might not touch it again for another couple of years. So I tried getting back into it a few times over the past decade or so. I mean, I bought all these bloody books, but I've read them and I've done some stuff with them, but I've not really got anywhere with anything. As I'm in a situation now where I've got an opportunity to work on my own stuff, I thought, you know what, maybe I'll try and right this wrong. I owe RISC OS a fair bit. I'm going to actually try and see if I can write some proper programs with RISC OS and maybe document the process, and then, because it is fairly difficult to get going, hopefully maybe inspire some other people to try it out. The Raspberry Pi platform's moved on a fair bit since then. That was the original Raspberry Pi 1 I have. Now I've got Raspberry Pi 3, but just today, as it happens, they've just announced the Raspberry Pi 400 little keyboard computer sort of thing, not unlike, say, 3010. So there's still a market for it out there, but obviously the operating system's not really moved on a huge amount since the 90s, and it's got a few deficiencies in it really, but it's quite fun. I've been using it for about 2 weeks now, and it is quite fun once you get going to try and play around with. Another thing I want to try and do is I've got this kind of empty shell of an Acorn A3010. It doesn't have a motherboard, but I thought maybe I could build a little circuit board that interfaces with the keyboard, and also I've got an old Acorn mouse, so maybe I could try and build a little board that takes a quadrature signal out of the Acorn mouse and converts it to USB. I thought that might be an interesting thing. I could also fit in maybe a hard drive, and I've got this little Wi-Fi adapter as well, so that's another side little job I can try and see if I can do. Well, I don't expect to make anything especially brilliant. It's more a case of playing around and documenting the process, and maybe I could chip in a little bit here and there with the actual operating system itself and see what people think. And obviously, being the internet, of course, everyone can tell me what I'm doing wrong, which will be plenty. I feel like I owe this operating system a fair bit, so I want to try and give something back. Okay, so here's the RISC OS Desktop. I'm using like a distribution called RISC OS Direct rather than like the straight RISC OS Open Limited distribution. This is created by a company called RISC OS Developments, and they're the company that actually bought out the license for RISC OS recently. And they have a download link on their website. And I installed this onto my Raspberry Pi 3 in the same way as there's actually a YouTube channel called Wi-Fi Sheep, which has got some installation instructions on the RISC OS Direct distribution. So I thought, okay, I'll use that and try and keep it consistent. So I'm capturing this on using a Mirrorbox USB 3 HDMI capture card. It's not great. I'm running this at quite a low resolution. I'm running it at 720p, and it has kind of softened the image a fair bit, so apologies for that. And also, as you can see, this this background obviously wasn't designed to be scaled. It's clearly designed to be run at 1080p. But I thought, for the purposes of actually making videos, it's probably better that the text size is slightly bigger. Rather than using an emulator, I'm actually using a proper Raspberry Pi 3. I've actually got it connected to the internet using a VONET VAR 11N300 sort of Ethernet to USB bridge, because at the moment RISC OS doesn't contain a Wi-Fi stack internally, so I've had to use an external Wi-Fi device for that. But I didn't really want to use an emulator because I wanted to actually run real applications on real hardware and actually make sure it works properly. So the default distribution for RISC OS Direct contains a a few little tools with it. It's got some emulators on there, so it's got this old Acorn mode thing, allows you to run earlier versions of RISC OS software, so like the 26-bit operating system. So it's effectively like an emulator within RISC OS itself that allows you to run RISC OS 3, I guess this is probably. Info. I've also got 8-bit, which is a BBC, but a BBC Micro is a bit before my time, so I'm not going to do anything with that. There's also a copy of DOSBox in there, which I used a little bit earlier in this video. So I gather you can install Windows 3.1 and stuff into this, but I never really tried it. I guess there's probably nothing on here at the moment, is there? No. Oh well, never mind. In the programming folder that it comes with, on this distribution, they've actually provided a copy of GCC. Now you should be able to, on applications, you should be able to go app, and there should be a little help thing there. I don't know what the support is, and this is a fairly old version of GCC, so I don't know what level of support there is for later versions of the C and C++ language features. I wrote a little application in C++, and I was playing it safe and trying to stick with C++ 03. I don't know what the C++ 11 or 14 even support's going to be. Let's say something about that. Changes. Edit, find. Not sure. So to get going with this, I actually, about a year or two ago, there's a tutorial online by a guy called James Hobson, and he did a series of tutorials for writing a WIMP application using GCC. He actually came up with a couple of good ideas which I've copied, because obviously I'm quite new to the platform really. So this boot application gets executed every time you boot up the machine, and you're able to use it to launch applications. So we've got a run feature there, so I've taken his advice and I've got it to run programming.c.gcc, so that loads all the environment variables. I've also got it to run UnixLib, which actually I'm not using at the moment. Also been using OSLib, which is a library of C-style wrappers around the operating system software interrupts. So to follow his tutorial stuff that I did, I actually copied his technique and included that in here as well. I mean, I'll probably stick with OSLib, but might use something else eventually. So to actually get OSLib, I think I had to install it from, should be a package manager somewhere, there we go. OSLib. Yeah, there we go, so I've installed OSLib, the help and some support functions. I don't really know what they are at the moment. The help is a strong help manual, and we'll probably be referring to that quite a bit. I did have like one afternoon of playing around with something, so I didn't really want to start until I've actually got some sort of direction. But I actually made a start on a really crappy app which I tried compiling this C++, but I've not really put a lot of effort into there's no design in this at all. I was just playing around and for a couple of hours. I mean, I just used an obey file for a make file. I need to actually start writing some proper make files. I'll tell you what, let's close this and we'll open strong ed instead, which I'm just getting used to being able to use. This is part of one of the barriers for RISC OS, is that things like the keyboard shortcuts and the use of like copying and pasting is very different. So it's taken me quite a while to get used to this. If we open main, let's see wherever that is. Right, so because this is inside a CPP folder, it's not recognised it as being a C or C++ file. So I've actually made some changes to the base mode on this. So if we switch over to C mode, notice the actual I've got a different font there. So actually, it's probably, now I've changed the screen resolution, it's probably a bit big actually, so let's knock that down a bit. So let's go to font, I'll make that 14. And so if you notice, instead of using the system font, I'm using this font here called Inconsolata. So what that is that it's an open source implementation of the consoler font that is used in VS Code. And what I did was I couldn't do it on RISC OS 5 because for some reason the font conversion tool doesn't work on that, but I actually used that font conversion tool to convert that TrueType font to a RISC OS font. I mean, if you wanted to use that, I could make that available on the link in the description. Let's hit save. I found it was giving me a bit of a headache looking at that system font all the time, although now I've actually changed the screen resolution down, it'd probably be okay. I was just playing around, so I came up with this sort of crappy library namespace. So I might make this a real thing, but I might not, I don't know. But what I wanted to do is just try and use classes to kind of contain the construction and creation and destruction of various things. So a task in RISC OS, task, there we go. Created a class called task. I didn't really want to expose any of the OSLib variables outside of using them internally to this class, so I've just made my own sort of crappy enumerations. And I've got a constructor for the task and then a destructor, and just temporarily I've got some sort of opaque class for a handle. So what I wanted to be able to do is just effectively create a task object, give it a name, and probably it might need some other parameters of that, but just by creating that object inside main, it will register with the WIMP, which is the desktop, the window manager effectively, that this is an application. And then when it goes out of scope and the destructor is called, it will effectively unload the application. So I'll probably throw all this away and then go through the process of doing it all again properly with a bit of actual design rather than playing around with it. So if I just quickly run this. So at the moment all I've got is it puts an icon on the icon bar, registers itself as an application task, and then when you click on it, creates a window. Yeah, I couldn't even be asked to get round to actually registering the event handlers for actually moving the windows around. So at the moment it's literally just creating a window. I just wanted to make sure more than anything that I could actually build the application. So again, looking back at the make file, basically this is almost completely based on James Hobson's initial sort of make file. One of the things I want to do is get proper error handling, exception handling and stuff like that in it. One of the interesting things about RISC OS error boxes is that they're kind of modal for the entire machine. If an error box pops up, you can't get the mouse outside of it. So what I want to do is I have an absolute top level exception handler which will use the WIMP based error box. But if there's any exceptions that are thrown further into the application rather than propagating all the way up to the top, I'll try and create my own version of that window that doesn't stop all the applications from being able to multitask. It will stop the versions of my programs from multitasking, but you'll still be able to go over there and click on edit or paint or something like that. I think I'm going to change this quite a bit actually, but I was just seeing if I could use some sort of event dispatcher. Effectively I'm using the observer design pan basically to be able to attach some sort of handler for whatever message you receive from the window manager. So what we have to do is, because this is a cooperatively multitasked application, we have to continuously send a message to the WIMP, polling it to ask it if it's got any messages, and at the point where we poll it, it also does its context switch and swaps out other programs. But then when it returns from that poll instruction, it should give us some sort of set of messages which we can decide whether or not we're going to process. I think I'm going to change a lot of this and we'll start it again. I just wanted to play around with some ideas really. So one of the things you might have noticed is that we use strong edit, and let's have a look at this icon bar one for example. So I created a really simple class with a couple of enumerations on that. So I had to customize this mode to try and make it. I found that system font a bit difficult for me to read actually. It was giving me a brain ache. But one of the things that I've noticed with strong edit, and I can't even use that, is it's just I'm so completely used to Windows based machines or even Linux that the times I was trying to write software before, I was just getting so frustrated about not even knowing how to copy and paste a bit of text. I've kind of figured it out now as I've been spending a bit more time on it, and I suspect what will be the case is that eventually I will end up using the RISC OS tools. But I think the first project I want to try and do, just as a sort of way in, is try and write my own text editor that has a kind of similar look and feel to like a really cut down version of maybe Visual Studio Code, but also so it uses the keyboard shortcuts that people who are coming from a PC world are expecting. So Control C, Control V, things things like, actually that's a good point. I wonder if we can do the indentation with the tab key on this. I think we might be able to. No, maybe not. What about shift tab? No. Okay. All right. Well, things like that, being able to indent blocks. Oh no, I've just commented that block out somehow. Oh. Oh dear. See, this is where I'm going wrong. I don't know half of this stuff, these shortcuts. So it's things like that. I mean, it's just it's like a completely different way of working, and there's only so many different ways of working you can face at once before you just give up, and I just don't want other people to face that. So yeah, I think the first thing we're going to give a go is, it'll be a really good exercise, because there's a lot to it, is we'll have a go at trying to make our own version of Visual Studio Code, try and make it extensible, give it the same sort of look and feel, same keyboard shortcuts. At the very least, I want the kind of like the bar you get down the side where it gives you the view of the project that you're looking at. Maybe you could put a bit of text highlighting. I don't think I'll go to the effort of trying to do something like IntelliSense. I can imagine that's a phenomenal amount of work to do that, and I'm not really interested in that. We might be able to hook this task window into the bottom of that application so you can run commands from it. I don't know. I think first things first is, I think what we're going to do is we'll come up with like a basic set of requirements for an initial project, which will be this code editor, and then once we've got the requirements, I'll kind of break it up into a bunch of like little tickets maybe, or something we could pretend to run into like a real project. And then I'll do like an iterative development. First thing I'll do is maybe get an icon on the icon bar, and then maybe pop a window up and then make it typeable or something like that. I don't know. As long as we design it in an okay way, it might be extensible, or maybe we could add features later. I don't know. Okay, so I guess the first upcoming video then is going to be, we'll throw all this stuff away. Oh, by the way, another thing I found out is that there is actually a very basic version of Git. Somebody on the forum has actually created a version of Git. So I've actually created a placeholder repository on GitHub for this text editor, and we'll try and I'll do like incremental commits from RISC OS, and we'll see if we can make that work as well. So yeah, I guess the first video coming up, this is obviously like a little discussion, me talking crap, coming up with the initial requirements and maybe a little bit of the start of the coding of the first feature of the text editor. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching.